The battle for Pokrovsk, about street fighting in the city and what the occupiers are lying about. How Aryeshnik was destroyed and other loud statements from the president and the security service of Ukraine. And most importantly, why the format of communication with journalists was quite unusual today. And also about the young woman whom the Russians sentenced to 14 years for loving her homeland. Is there a chance to free 21-year-old Yana, who did not side with the enemy after the occupation? We will discuss these topics further in the program. The week's highlights on the United Marathon broadcast. I am Solomia Witvitska, TSN. The number of victims in the Kherson region has increased. There are already 19 of them. This morning, the Russians launched a massive artillery attack on the regional center, targeting residential areas and the market in the Dnipro district. A man and a woman were killed. 14 city residents sustained injuries and wounds. Another civilian was hospitalized due to a drone attack. Later, the enemy army shelled Bilozerka and Darivka. 4 local residents were injured there. And in Donetsk region, the occupiers killed 8 people and wounded 18 more. A series of strikes was carried out on Sloviansk. There, 3 people were killed and 3 others were injured. In the city, 10 apartment buildings, a boiler house, a cafe, a school, and a post office were damaged. Kostiantynivka also came under enemy fire. 2 city residents were killed and 6 were wounded. At night, the Russians launched a massive attack on Odessa region with strike drones. About 12 Shaheds targeted the energy sector. The enemy directed them at civilian infrastructure facilities. A fire broke out after a strike hit an industrial facility. The Dnipro region also came under attack. The occupiers struck a business in Pavlohrad with a drone. There is 1 person wounded there. In Sinelnikivsky district, a woman was killed. In Nikopol district, a man was injured as a result of shelling. Now, to the situation at the front. The fiercest fighting is currently taking place for Pokrovsk. The occupiers are storming Ukrainian positions, but the defenders are managing to push them back. Some of the hottest battles are happening in Novotoretske, Udakhne and Molodetske. On the Kostiantynivka axis, the enemy is pressing in the areas of Shkerbinivka, Petrivka, Yablunivka and Rusin Yar. Another difficult section of the front is the Kupiansk direction. Ukrainian defenders are repelling the enemy's assault actions in the areas of Kupiansk itself, as well as Stepov, Novoselivka, and towards Pischane and Petropavlivka. Aviation, rocket forces, and artillery of the defense forces struck 7 areas where the occupiers had concentrated personnel, weapons, and military equipment. The Russians continue to put pressure on Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad. Street fighting is already taking place in the northern outskirts of Pokrovsk as the enemy is getting closer and closer to the road that connects the city with neighboring Myrnohrad. The situation is threatening as acknowledged by the general staff, but they deny that the defense forces in the city are blocked. However, the same cannot be said about the outskirts where our infantry is now stationed. TSN special correspondent Yulia Kirienko will give a detailed account of what is happening in Pokrovsk. So watch her report next.
A firefight, mortar shelling and an attack by strike drones. These are drone pilots from the 25th Airborne. They are trying to withdraw from Pokrovsk where their positions were located. And they evacuate the wounded because they had to engage in a gun battle with the enemy. The fact that the occupiers had advanced into the city itself is evidenced by the tricolour that the enemy infantry had placed on the southwestern ceiling. Pokrovskia. In an hour, our kamikaze drone flies at him and shoots him down. And this means that the Russians have indeed entered the city's residential areas. At the beginning of the week, the situation in Pokrovsk began to deteriorate significantly. Groups of Russians were spotted near the railway and in central neighborhoods. The city was gradually turning into a grey zone, and the Russians began to put pressure on it and on neighboring Myrnohrad from 3 sides. If you look at the deep state map now, you can see that Pokrovsk is essentially divided into 2 parts. Currently, there are several hundred people left in the city. The Russians. They infiltrated there through the village of Zvirov and on May 1st. Their objective, as they say. For the defense forces, it is to reach its northern outskirts and cut off the road between Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad. Russia has amassed a group of up to 11,000 occupiers to push our troops out of the agglomeration. Pokrovsk-Myrnohrad. This is according to the very corps that is holding the defense there. Putin has already claimed that both cities are blocked, but that's not true. Enemy infantry is being hunted down and destroyed, and advancing is anything but easy for them.
They are trying to amass forces at this point in order to later move them and launch an assault the enemy may deploy small groups on motorcycles. There was also an incident 2 days ago where 2 motorcycles, along with their crews, were destroyed. Today, more enemy motor vehicles have also been destroyed.
The Russians are operating in Pokrovsk, just like they once pushed our troops out of Kherson. First, they covered the entire sky. There were so many drones over our defenders that the infantry had to enter their positions over the course of several days, walking dozens of kilometers on foot with supplies and ammunition.
Sometimes for 3 days or even longer, they were forced to hide somewhere, waiting until the enemy shifted their attention away from them. If we take Pokrovsk as an example now, they already enter there in larger groups and then move through the city accordingly.
Then they started pressing with infantry from the flanks. Their objective, according to the defense forces, is to reach the road connecting Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad and block it in order to finally cut off the last remaining supply routes to our infantry that still exist.
If they move up to Kherson, then the Pokrovsk, Myrnohrad, the epic, the saga that has been going on for over a year and a half, can be considered over. In the entire northern part, you have the situation where street fighting and shootouts are currently taking place. It's chaos.
But the enemy is already entering the northern part. That is, they are partially present in the northern part. And there too, these constant clashes are happening, and they're quite intense. And the problem is that in addition to the terrible, extremely difficult logistics, you have to go on foot there.
The General Staff now states that our troops, despite the fighting in the city, are not encircled. This is indeed the case, as confirmed by OSINT analysts. But the infantry, which has been stationed on the outskirts of Pokrovsk, in the Lysivka and Novopavlivka area for more than a year and a half, is in a very difficult situation. Yulia Krienko, Alexander Shian, Timofey Koshchi, TSN 1+1 Marathon United News.
They eliminated Oreshnik before it became mainstream. The President and the Security Service of Ukraine. For the first time, they spoke about the elimination of Oreshnik in Kapustin Yar, Russia. And this happened in the summer of 2023. According to Zelensky, the Russians had the opportunity to make 3 shots in total, one of which they used. According to intelligence, the Russians are not capable of producing up to 6 such missiles per year, and in the near future, they plan to deploy Oreshnik in Belarus. Its flight range is up to 5,000 kilometers. What other high-profile statements were made during the meeting at the President's office, where there was an unusual interaction with journalists? Natalia Ostrovska will tell us more.
Around a round table with coffee, stacks of documents, maps and journalists who could shout out questions. An informal briefing took place at the President's office. The President gathered the head of the Security Service of Ukraine, the head of Foreign Intelligence, the Commissioner for Sanctions Policy and the Minister of Foreign Affairs. I'll tell you now what information was revealed here for the first time. We enter the office where a meeting was held just a few minutes ago. The cameraman immediately turns on the camera and manages to capture Volodymyr Zelensky signing documents.
And what are we signing right now?
We're signing the 20s.
Twice, one for propaganda cases, one for incidents.
On November 20th, new American sanctions against Russia will come into effect. The list includes the largest oil companies, Lukoil and Rosneft. Zelensky hopes that as a result, within a year, the Russians will lose $50 billion. And in 2026, the budget deficit of the aggressor country could grow to $100 billion.
Canada, Australia, Britain, Japan, the EU. These are our key partners who have reduced imports to a minimum or even to zero. Imports from the Russian Federation. And those who actually increased it, India, China, Turkey, and Central Asia, the former Soviet colleagues, so to speak. Yes, this is something we need to work on, and there is a vision for how to address it.
But Zelensky reminds us that China remains Russia's biggest helper in the war. Whether Trump managed to influence Xi during their personal meeting on October 30th, the Ukrainian president says, is still unknown. In response to my clarification about how Ukraine is reacting to China's ban on exporting important drone components, the president answers as follows.
China has massively restricted exports to European Union countries. Because I know that when all of us were searching, and you know that brigades were separately funded because we were looking everywhere, we separately funded each brigade so that they could all gather through their own channels. Wherever it was possible to get even half a drone until we started mass producing our own.
Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha adds that some European countries are lifting sanctions against Putin's inner circle, which is funding the war. Meanwhile, the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service, Ole Vashchenko, announces the preparation of a new package of sanctions.
I have to admit it. And some European countries are even trying to remove certain Russian oligarchs from the sanctions packages. That's why we will continue to defend and insist on the position of sanctioning Russian big business and oligarchs who are involved in the functioning of the Russian war machine.
As of today, our tasks have been defined jointly with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Security Service is working on the 20th package, and there are already plans for the 21st sanctions package.
According to experts, Russian oil product exports have now dropped to their lowest level since the start of the full-scale invasion. And the reason is not only Western sanctions.
I like the possibility of linking kinetic sanctions with traditional sanctions. I mean that specifically by striking critical infrastructure facilities, the Federation then has to repair certain facilities.
The head of the security service, Vasil Maliuk, talks about the impact of such long-range attacks.
Since the beginning of the year, there have been almost 160 successful strikes on oil extraction and oil refining facilities. If we look at September and October of this year, that's 20 facilities. Among them are 6 refineries, 2 oil terminals, 3 oil depots, and 9 oil pumping stations.
But not just sanctions. The president of the SBU speaks publicly, perhaps for the first time, about the destruction of one of the 3 Russian missiles. Nutcracker? It turns out that this happened back in the summer of 2023 in the territory of Kapustiny Yar. Russia has already used another Oreshnik, so there is one more left. The missile's range is 5,500 kilometers. Due to its high speed and trajectory, the missile is difficult to intercept even with modern air defense systems. Vasil Maliuk tells TSN about the details of the operation.
The destruction was 100%. It was a very successful operation, but at that time it was not publicized in any way. This was reported exclusively to the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, the President of Ukraine. A few others also knew about it. Several presidents of other countries. We carried out everything quite successfully. There was 100% confirmation. This was at a time when the name Oreshnik was, in principle, still unknown to the general public, not in use, and the Russians had not yet started to threaten with it in particular.
Meanwhile, there is something that now worries both the military and civilians. Most of all, the shifting line of combat engagements. We're talking about Pokrovsk. The president says that the battle for this city is ongoing. The Russians who enter the city destroy it, but there is no encirclement. And what about Putin's plans to come to Pokrovsk? Zelensky responds with sarcasm.
Putin says that he will go to Pokrovsk. Yes, by all means, if he comes to Pokrovsk. Everyone will be applauding. We understand how it will all end. And
that was the last question. The president's spokesperson. He called this format of off-camera communication with journalists experimental. But it is very similar to the one practiced at the White House, where local journalists have already gotten used to shouting questions at the president. Natalia Ostrovska, Lucy Osevchuk, Marathon United News, TSN 1+1.
There will be only one peace plan. Right now, Ukraine and its allies are developing it together. There are no alternative plans from individual countries or competing initiatives. This was stated by the head of the president's office, Andriy Yermak, in an interview with Herbik Ukraine. Yermak refuted media reports claiming that there are supposedly different peace plans. Supposedly the US has one plan and the EU has another. According to him, working discussions on its formation are currently ongoing. But all partners are in constant dialogue, which will result in a single document jointly developed by Ukraine and its partners that will take Ukrainian interests into account. Presidents Zelensky and Trump, as well as European leaders, all agree that any negotiations must begin with a ceasefire and along the current line of contact. This is the key to successful diplomatic work, Yermak emphasized. Is the world returning to a Cold War? This week, Donald Trump announced the resumption of nuclear weapons testing. Due to their extraordinary and destructive power, I didn't want to do this, but I have no choice, he wrote on Truth Social. He added that the reason was similar actions by other countries. However, nuclear weapons experts are skeptical about such intentions of the American president. We will discuss this in more detail with TSN's own correspondent in the USA, Olha Koshelenko. She is now live from the studio in Washington. So, Olha, welcome. Trump did not directly specify which country's actions prompted him to issue the order, as he writes, for the Pentagon to begin nuclear weapons testing. But we know that Putin boasts about Russian weapons tests. And just this week, there was the nuclear-powered missile, the Burevestnik, and the nuclear drone Poseidon. Not to mention the Orishnik, which the Russian dictator is now threatening to deploy in Belarus this time. Is this a signal from Trump to Putin? The floor is yours.
Solly, well, obviously that's the case because Trump even said directly this week that Putin's rhetoric is unacceptable. And instead he should focus on ending the war in Ukraine. But let's still go back to that message on Truth Social, which you already mentioned a bit earlier. And experts are saying that there are several glaring mistakes in it. Well, first of all, the President of the United States claims that America has the largest nuclear arsenal. Analysts say that's not true. Russia actually has more nuclear warheads. Second, he writes that he ordered the Pentagon to resume nuclear testing, but experts point out that in the United States, this issue actually falls under the responsibility of the Department of Energy. And most importantly, Trump writes that he was prompted to take such actions by similar moves from other countries. But first and foremost, the only country that continues to conduct nuclear tests is North Korea. And by the way, not so long ago, when the President of the United States was asked by reporters about another test by Pyongyang, he responded that it did not really bother him because, as he explained, they do it all the time. As for other countries, the Soviet Union conducted its last nuclear test in the year 1990. The United States did so in 92 and China in 96. And what Russia is doing now is testing delivery systems such as missiles or underwater drones. Yes, with a nuclear engine, but not actually with nuclear warheads. During the test, this weapon did not carry any. And in addition, the New York Times looked into the current state of the American test site for underground nuclear tests in Nevada. And it turned out that the site has been abandoned, especially since the last test, which took place more than 30 years ago, and no one has maintained it since then. And in 2013, the US Department of Energy reported that even for preparing very limited tests there, it would take 6 to 10 months of preparation. And even US Vice President J.D. Vance on the eve of the event significantly softened his rhetoric. He toned down his statements, noting that they simply want to check the condition of their nuclear weapons.
Sometimes you need to check to make sure everything is functioning and working properly. We are working very closely, even with countries with whom we do not have the best relations, in order to try to limit the proliferation of nuclear weapons. The President will continue to work on this. But this is an important part of America's national security, to make sure that the nuclear arsenal we have is actually functioning properly. And this is part of the testing regime. Frankly, we know that it is working properly, but it needs to be constantly monitored over time. And the President just wants to make sure that we are doing that.
So it's worth waiting to see whether Donald Trump's actions or his belligerent rhetoric will lead to any real steps. But there's another conclusion that suggests itself here. Unlike the previous administration, which avoided nuclear escalation, even in words, the Trump administration is responding to Russia's rhetorical escalation in kind. Solyu?
Olya, and we can't help but mention the meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping. For the first time since Trump returned to the White House, he met with the Chinese leader. And it was also highly anticipated that Ukraine would be discussed during the talks between the presidents. Tell me, how are the news about this meeting being commented on in the US in particular?
Solely, Donald Trump himself called this meeting very important, saying that many decisions were made, but it's worth remembering that he tends to describe all his meetings in this way as very important and productive. In the context of the war in Ukraine, so far we've only heard from him that they talked about Ukraine for a long time. And supposedly they agreed that leader Xi would help resolve it. But this doesn't sound very promising. Let me quote. "We agreed that both sides are stuck in the war and are allowing them to keep fighting. This is madness. Xi will help us regarding Ukraine, but we can't do much more." This doesn't mean that there were no agreements made there. Perhaps we just don't know about them yet. But in the public part, the leader of the PRC only said that the two countries can cooperate for the benefit of their peoples and the whole world to achieve peace. And he praised Donald Trump for his contribution to peace in the Middle East and in Asia. From the American point of view, however, the main subject of the negotiations was the trade war between the US and China. Donald Trump primarily uses this tool to put pressure on other countries. And it's already hard to even count how many times Trump has threatened to raise tariffs, for example, specifically against China. This, for instance, was also supposed to happen tomorrow. A 100% increase in tariffs. But a few days before the meeting, the leaders of the economic teams met ahead of the Trump-Xi summit. And the negotiators reached a consensus, thanks to which, as Xi Jinping said, the high-level meeting took place. So obviously this card didn't work this time. Solyu.
Thank you, Olya. Our special correspondent for TSN, Olha Koshelenko, was just with us live from the USA, and we discussed all the latest statements by Donald Trump in particular and everything being said about this in the US. Thank you, Olya. Viktor Orbán is looking for new anti-Ukrainian allies in Europe. And he is looking towards the Czech Republic, where the political force of former Prime Minister Andrej Babiš won the parliamentary elections. A politician who favors dialogue with Moscow rather than economic pressure may once again head the Czech government. The formation of the coalition is in its final stage. Most likely, Eurosceptic and anti-Ukrainian parties will be part of it. Will Ukraine risk getting a second Orbán in the European Union? Our Radio Svoboda correspondent in Brussels, Zoriana Stepanenko, will tell us more.
Andrej Babiš is not yet prime minister, but he is already establishing connections in Brussels. The Czech politician came here yesterday, although in fact he is rather renewing his contacts. Babiš led the Czech government from 2017 to 2021, so he is remembered here, although a lot has changed since then. And many are uneasy about the reaction to these changes. Babiš. He advocates dialogue with Moscow rather than pressure on it to bring about an end to the war. He warned that he might withdraw from the so-called ammunition initiative, under which Prague was searching for ammunition for Ukraine around the world and raising funds for it. Babiš did not rule out delegating the initiative to NATO. He also did not plan to allocate funds from the Czech budget to aid Ukraine. And he did not approve of the idea of Ukraine's EU membership, supposedly in order to protect European farmers. He also promised to drastically reduce aid to Ukrainian refugees. His coalition partners, in turn, even advocated for leaving the EU and NATO. However, Babiš's party was quick to assure that this would not happen. In fact, there was definitely politics involved. There was something to discuss with the Secretary General of the Alliance. They had dinner together yesterday. There aren't many details about how the conversation went.
Mark Rutte and I have known each other for 9 years. Today we reminisced about old times, but mostly discussed current events in world politics. It was a pleasant meeting. Thank you for the invitation to a friendly lunch.
The future Czech government is looking to Viktor Orbán with hope. The foreign policy advisor to the Hungarian Prime Minister is optimistic about the creation of a potential anti-Ukrainian alliance that would unite Hungary and Slovakia, and now also the Czech Republic. At least that's what he told Politico. Hungary's plan is to coordinate actions with its partners before EU summits and to hold joint consultations. Will such cooperation interest Andrej Babiš and his team? Radio Liberty reached out to his political party for comment, but has not yet received a response. Babiš's and Orbán's political parties are already united in one group in the European Parliament, and now the alliance exists at the leaders' level as well. Czech analysts see this as a logical continuation, although some are skeptical. Some experts believe that Babiš will not accept Orbán's proposal.
If Andrej Babiš truly valued cooperation with Germany, France, or other countries in the European Parliament, he would be part of the relevant factions that include non-populist parties. But he decided that he does not want to continue this cooperation. Moreover, he had a chance to form a coalition here in the Czech Republic with non-populist parties, but he decided he didn't want to have it.
Andrej Babiš, the pragmatist. He understands that a stronger alliance with Viktor Orbán and Robert Fico will not earn him any political points, but rather will contribute to the marginalization of the country. They are isolated, considered troublemakers, black sheep, EU politicians. He doesn't want to be part of that. Meanwhile, acting as a kind of intermediary between some difficult partners in the EU and those who actually make the decisions can be a much more advantageous position.
The view that Babiš would not be interested in cooperating with Orbán on an anti-Ukrainian agenda is shared by most experts surveyed by Radio Svoboda. They believe that businessman and billionaire Babiš will primarily assess what is beneficial for his country, and ultimately he might agree to sell weapons to Ukraine. Just as, for example, he does not object to cooperation with Slovak private companies. Robert Fico? Babiš, it will be a somewhat milder, some kind of Fico variation. He probably will not, as he says that the Czech Republic will not be making any donations to Ukraine at this time. military support, shells and so on, military equipment, but will sell it instead. Babiš and Fico are traders. Orbán is an ideologue. And the main ideology for Fico and Babiš is power and money. Regarding Ukrainian initiatives at the EU level, analysts do not rule out that Babiš may block some of them, but not out of principle or ideological reasons like Viktor Orbán, but rather out of a desire to bargain for something he needs from the European Union. This is standard practice in the bloc, which unites 27 different countries and accordingly different leaders. Over the next 2 years, elections will be held in half of these states, and given the growing popularity of right-wing parties, according to experts, this trend is alarming for Ukraine. From Brussels, Zoriana Stepanenko, Marek Hajduk, Radio Svoboda, especially for TSN 1+1. Marathon, United News.